Thank you. Great. So my title is Power in the People, Republican Rome and Implications for Civic Action Today. And I want to begin with this comment by Bruno Latour from about, I think, 10 years ago. But if anything, we could re-emphasize this sentiment now. He says, we live in rather discouraging times as far as political life is concerned, but this is why it might be a good occasion to rethink what politics is about. So my first question in response to what Bruno Latour is provoking us to think about is a self-critical question for all of us studying ancient Rome or ancient Greece or really any other society, especially one based in the deep past. And that's this question, which is, beyond nostalgia, beyond a certain antiquarian curiosity, why should we bother thinking about Republican Rome? 2,000 years in the past, what does it have to offer us? And I ask this question because for about the last 20 years, there's been quite a hot debate in the United States about whether it's legitimate or valuable or worth our time, to look back to Mediterranean antiquity for anything that it might be able to tell us. I should put this in context in terms of American political thought and intellectual history. There was a movement that began in the 1970s among political theorists and political scientists, mostly in the UK and in the United States, who were impatient on the one hand with liberalism and the failures of liberal politics and liberal thought. And particularly the emphasis in liberal thought on the individual and individual freedom and agency, and the de-emphasis of community and the values of democratic socialism, a de-emphasis on intersubjectivity and communication. So there was impatience with liberalism on the one hand. I mean, I know this is a very familiar impatience and it's not specifically American by any means, but again, just trying to put in context the interest in Rome. So impatience with liberal thinking, but also impatience with 19th and 20th century forms of communitarian thought and practice. So a movement emerged that actually called itself neo-republicanism or new republicanism. People like Michael Sandel, who's now at Harvard, Maurizio Veroli, originally Italian, moved to the US, he's now at Princeton. And they shared this worry that liberal thought kind of over-concentrated on the individual and individual rights, offered too slender a conception of civic duty and civic interconnection. And they thought that and argued that Republican ideals, which to which they turned to Roman texts as the point of origin, and to a certain degree to Aristotle as well, but really focusing on Rome, they argued that Republican texts offered a corrective to that thin and impoverished and a form of civic life that was not actively participatory, where even voting, numbers of people voting in the United States and many democracies in Europe and Latin America are very low. So to try to correct that, they thought, also that Republican thinking in the work of Cicero, a thinker I'll come back to at the end, that it doesn't shy away from the big issues. It takes on big questions, including the fundamental human question, how shall I live? And the corollary to that, how shall I live in company with other people? And the argument of these neo-Republicans was that the Roman thinkers and then recovery Republican thinkers of the later European tradition, like Machiavelli, offered a powerful and also very demanding answer that we should all seek to live well, which is to say specifically to live politically, to have a political life, to live as a citizen, to act always with a view to the impact that our acts have on other people, because we're all part owners of public affairs. And I think everyone in this group will know that the word republic itself, res publica, the public thing, in Latin means essentially public affairs. So this, as I said, movement began in the 1970s, and by the 1990s and early 2000s, a real reaction set in, and it clustered around anti-racist thinkers, feminist thinkers, communitarian thinkers who are, I would say, in general, further to the left, people who pointed to the intertwining of Republican thinking with patriotism, with a certain high value on masculine kind of traditional definitions of manly virtue. And these critics said essentially the intertwining of Republican thinking with patriotism, with masculinism and misogyny, with militarism, with imperialism, and with the history of imperialism, all of this really makes the Republican tradition essentially illegitimate. I mean, just unpalatable. We can't use it as a model, was the argument. So that's really my starting point, to make sure that we're all asking that question and kind of checking in with ourselves before, or I should say, checking in with myself before I turn to a tradition that is so complicated and so loaded with implications, with imperialism, with oppression, to ensure that I don't use this tradition comfortably or complacently, but creatively and with a view to its limitations. So this isn't about, and my work in general is not about saying that Republican thought has all the answers. It's certainly not arguing that it's a simple tradition or one we should absorb wholesale, but really to flip that question and to say it's precisely because the beliefs and practices that Romans took for granted. They took for granted slavery, the disenfranchisement of women, the total absence of a strong theory of individual rights. They lived in conditions of staggering economic inequality, even worse than the United States today, which is saying a lot. They lived in conditions of near total domination of politics by a rich and self-righteous dynastic senatorial elite who never questioned their right to power and their right to authority. They lived in conditions of devotion to warfare on a massive scale. The Romans in the Republican and Imperial, through the early Imperial period, as we'll see in a few minutes, went to war just about every year. One historian talks about the Roman habit of going to war as he says, and I quote, the Romans treated war almost as a biological necessity. That was how they behaved. They went to war every single season in an attempt to exploit and extract wealth and property and slaves from their neighbors. They valued not only the battlefield, but gladiatorial combat, violence as entertainment, and did I say economic inequality? I mean, I can't emphasize that enough, that the Romans elite Romans lived comfortably and never criticized, as far as we know from their written texts, the conditions of economic inequality under which 95% of the population lived either on subsistence level or conditions of minimum comfort. So as I say, this is all true. Roman Republican politics was violently skewed to preserve elite wealth and power. There were limits on who could speak in the voting assemblies and in deliberative assemblies in the city of Rome, and we'll come to that. And I want to add one more thought that we can add to this criticism of the use of Rome. When we think about the history of efforts to look back to the Roman Republic for inspiration, yes, late 18th century thinkers and I don't call them revolutionaries because I don't think of the war in the late 18th century in America in 1776 as a revolution. It wasn't a revolution in my view. It was a war of independence from imperial domination. but there were certainly thinkers and fighters at that time who were inspired in interesting ways by the writings of Republican Romans, like Cicero, like Virgil. But for every one of those who sought and found a language of freedom and equality in these ancient Roman writings, there were 10 Southern plantation owners who used Rome as an excuse for slavery. There were 10 fascists in the 1930s and 1940s seeking to revive and justify ideas of empire in the United States. There were American post-war politicians calling America the new Rome. And I don't want to forget casino owners using Rome and Caesar to decorate casinos and related places with statues of Caesar in order to praise and lift up consumerism and kind of high capitalism. But as I said, I'm trying to flip the script here and say it's actually precisely because elitism and inequality, sexism, racism, nativist patriotism, it's because those things are and remain deeply institutionalized in modern democracy that I think Rome and efforts to recuperate the Republican tradition are still useful to us. It's because Rome still has purchase in pop culture that it remains a usable reference point. And finally, as I kind of bring this introduction to a close, it's because the Romans hold up a mirror to our political and cultural weak spots that I think they're worth studying. As I said, they lived in a state of contradiction. They talk about their dedication to liberty, but they're absolutely devoted to the preservation of slavery and social and economic inequity. They're devoted to the ideals of active citizenship, again, in the ideal, in the principle, but in practice, they impose severe limits on popular deliberation and voting rights. So I think as a group, as academics, as scholars, as students, as citizens, we need to understand how injustice and oppression can live alongside and even potentially feed the belief that a state should be free and just and equitable. So that's why I believe, and I want to try to convince you today and explain some reasons why I think that Roman thought and practice can prompt us to think creatively and self-critically about the kind of politics and the kind of political habits we need to cultivate now, both on the institutional level and the personal level. So let me let me continue with a little bit of history and historical context. I've been talking about the Roman Republic very much in the abstract, but just to remind us of the time and place we're in. And I have in mind a good turning point in the history of the Roman Republic, which is the Ides of March and the assassination of Julius Caesar, who, as I'm sure you all know, had sought to take power and hold on to individual autocratic power until he was killed by a group of rivals, essentially, other senatorial elites, all of them wealthy, most of them from very well-born noble families. And my starting point here is not to dig into the reasons behind why Caesar was assassinated, but rather what happened next and why didn't that assassination lead to a revival of Republican government, why it instead led to the conspirators being hunted down, killed, defeated in battle, and why it opened up hundreds of years following of autocratic rule in the Roman Empire. I think we can capture the fate of the conspirators against Caesar in just 4 words. They had no plan. Why didn't they have a plan? Well, in my view, they didn't take seriously or think hard enough. And I think I can say that Cicero would agree with me, because we have letters from Cicero to Brutus, the leader of the conspirators, that convey essentially this belief that the conspirators failed to grasp the significance of the 4 letters you're looking at, SPQR, the Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. This is, you've seen this before, this is the banner on the Roman, carried by the Roman legions. These letters appear on many Roman coins. And of course, they appear in 20th century Italian architecture, especially in the city of Rome, because Mussolini and the fascist government reappropriated this, this slogan, Senate and the people of Rome, as the emblem of the new Italian fascist empire as they conceived it in the 1930s and 40s. But the meaning of this behind these four letters, SPQR, is what I want to dwell on as the kind of starting point or the landscape in which I want to draw three lessons or three provocations, 3 points for us to think about as we think about our own political practice. What does the Senatus Populusque Romanus, mean? What does it mean that these four letters, all on an equal setting, would be the banner, the emblem of the Republican Roman Empire? Well, they mean, to me, and to most Roman historians and scholars of Roman literature and culture, they mean that Rome in the Republican period, the 1st century BCE, it's an aristocratic, plutocratic, rich oligarchy. That's what the Senate is. It is a small group of families, consistent. The membership in the Senate is pretty consistent over centuries. It's absolutely exclusively the domain of the rich, of the very, very rich. There are requirements, property requirements that affect who belongs to the Senate. But you see the tweak here, that it's not just the Senate, the Roman Senate, that is the emblem of the Roman state, but SP, Populusque. And this is what the conspirators who murdered Caesar failed to take into account, that throughout Republican history, the senators who were the rich oligarchy, they dominated political decision-making. They made all the decisions about what would even come to the attention of government, let alone government policy. But they had to include, in certain constrained ways, attention to the people, to the Roman people and the Roman popular opinion in a very limited way. I'm not claiming a big space here, but that relationship between the Senate and the people is the dynamic, and the power of the people is the piece of the equation that the conspirators left out. Well, why did the Senate have to pay attention to the people? And by people, I should explain, I'm talking about Roman citizens, adult men who lived within, either in the city of Rome or within striking distance of the city of Rome. There were certainly Roman citizens as the empire grew, scattered all around the Mediterranean, but in practice, their citizenship as far as Republican politics and government went was very limited, because voting, as I'm sure you all know, had to happen by law in the city of Rome. There was no phone-in ballots. There was no absentee voting. So that put a physical constraint on who could act as a citizen, again, as I'm sure you know. So, but why did the Senate, this rich oligarchy, aristocratic oligarchy, have to pay attention to the people in the first place? And the answer is in this slide and in the two that follow. When from very early on in Rome's history, and you see here the 4th century BCE, the haves, the senatorial elite, had to convince the have-nots to go to war. And again, as I said at the beginning, the Romans went to war virtually every single year for about 3 centuries as they've built their empire. So over time, because the elites in the Senate had to, they sought opportunities to compete with one another for power, for status, for wealth. That meant competition in public, ensuring audiences for that competition. This is part and parcel of the emergence of patron-client relationships in Roman neighborhoods, and the staging of speeches and other ways to engage the public of the Roman people, the Roman citizens living in and near the city of Rome. That was a crucial part of senatorial authority and senatorial competition. So you could say that over time, given the need to persuade the have-nots, the poor, to engage and participate literally, to put their lives on the line, to go to war, the senatorial elite had every interest to preserve kind of points of contact and engagement between them and the people who were fighting their wars. And we see the result by 86 BCE and by 8 BCE, the growth of this, persuasive politics as success grew and built on success defined in the way I'm using the word right now, from the Roman point of view of expanding the limits of their ability to exploit and extract wealth from their neighboring territories. But by the time that Caesar was born, this system had begun to break down. You could say that the senatorial elite had preserved popular sovereignty and had preserved these moments of elite popular contact in order to shore up and preserve their own power. But again, by the time Julius Caesar came to gain power, gained a role as a general of his army, there was deep unrest in the system. The system was fragmented and under a lot of pressure. Now, a lot of the unrest stemmed from a growing sense of disconnection between the people and the senatorial elite. Income inequality had grown significantly from the 2nd century to the 1st. Costs of living were rising. There was a shortage of decent food and housing in the city of Rome. There were bad job prospects. There was high unemployment and a level of immigration and cultural change that felt out of control to a lot of people. And if this sounds familiar, it should. Now, the success of Julius Caesar and also his heir Octavian, who becomes Augustus, lay in as they sought to consolidate their own power and deepen their own power, was due in great part to their very clever exploitation of the tensions between the people and the senatorial elite. So through bribes, through public celebrations that offered opportunities to feed and entertain people, Caesar strengthened the ties between himself as an individual and the people. And that, as I said, was one element, a crucial component of his success that the conspirators, his murderers, seem to have completely overlooked. They themselves didn't expect that clearly the popular uprising at his death. They didn't expect the anger and the desire for revenge that was very visible in the Roman city after Caesar's murder. And so this is what they missed, that Rome's Republican politics requires successful connection between elites and the people. So let me give you one more example, because we have kind of very frustratingly, we don't have very much of Caesar's, we don't have much evidence of Caesar's himself speaking to the people. We have Caesar reporting on his speeches to his army and to a degree to groups of citizens, but we, there are good reasons to be suspicious about that evidence. So instead, I'm going to use as an example of the kind of rhetoric, the kind of language that Caesar surely used to connect and to build popular support and connections by looking to his uncle, Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius was born into an Italian family, not a Roman family based in Rome, but a family in Italy with actually very few connections to the Roman elite at the top circles. But Marius made his fortune and his political career in the military. And according to Sallust, who is writing in the mid-1st century BCE, Marius built his popular support in part around the argument that while other men could appeal to their family's glorious deeds, or they could enlist the help of rich allies and other politicians, Marius was on his own, and his power, as he presented it, rested solely, and of course he's exaggerating, but he's saying solely on popular support. And here's one quotation this is a speech of Marius to a popular assembly as recorded by a historian. "But my hopes," he says, "rest in me alone and must be advanced by my virtue and my integrity. Every eye is turned on me. Good and honorable men prefer me because my actions help the Republic." Now, reading this several years ago in 2016, I couldn't help thinking about Donald Trump. There was a campaign speech that Trump gave in the Midwest where he said, and I quote, "I didn't have to bring J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez, or Jay-Z. I'm here all by myself, just me. No guitar, no piano, no nothing." So Marius also likes to contrast his blunt style with the hoity-toity language of his political rivals. Marius says in around 105 BCE, he says, "My words aren't very well chosen, but I don't care. Virtue shows itself on its own. They're the ones, the rich politicians." Of course, Marius is also at this point a rich politician, but he says they are the ones that need artificial aids to cover over their crimes with fancy words. So no teleprompter for Marius. He doesn't need this. It's also something Donald Trump liked to say, that he didn't need a teleprompter. He could speak directly to the people. So when Marius dismisses his rival's investment in Greek methods of education, Greek cultural values, that's an especially brilliant move. It has a long history of old-fashioned Roman moralism. You essentially, Marius gives logic and rhetoric a foreign face. He calls it un-Roman, and he throws it out the window. And Marius ended up winning Rome's highest office, the consulship, 7 times. He broke every precedent. But this is really important. I mean, for all that Romans like to think of themselves as self-controlled and self-sacrificial, and that's a central part of Roman cultural identity and self-presentation, excess and breaking rules was a key part of Marius's appeal. It actually became proof of his leadership, proof that he could be relied upon as a single leader. And this was exactly the same for Julius Caesar, who cultivated a public persona in some contexts of gravity and good judgment. He was the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Roman religion. He presented himself as deserving public trust. But his actual career was a series of acts of total excess, of extravagance, of violence, and very public rule breaking. You might remember from, if you know Julius Caesar's biography as a young man, he was captured by pirates. He vowed revenge. He arranged to have a ransom paid to the chief pirate so that he would be released. He ended up getting some ships together and capturing these pirates, and left them on hundreds of them on rows of crosses. And he crucified them in revenge for what they'd done to him. And at this point, he was not even 20 years old. So this is a kind of person who defines excess and especially excessive violence as at the heart of his persona, at the heart of why he can be depended on to act and to lead. So we can compare, obviously, the contemporary scene, and this is the flip side, obviously, the always two sides of the coin when it comes to building popular connections. But I think really important to emphasize that that bluster and arrogance, as well as excess and outrageousness, is key to the Roman autocratic building of connection to the people. It's part of the performance of power that distracts everyone and keeps everyone in a state of suspense. It's not conducive to reasonable political discourse. So in response to this, and I'm going to turn now to my 3 brief lessons of what we can do in response to this, I turn to the work of Cicero, because he was living with Caesar, living with the conditions of violence and a sense of loss of rules, a loss of standards, the erasure of tradition. that Caesar had created. And so Cicero, in writing in response to Caesar's rule breaking and his for many years successful power grab, in the work of Cicero, we can discern 3 points that are useful for us to think about today. The first is Cicero's emphasis, and this is really how he understood the Republic, as divided between the have and have-nots. It's a reality check. Cicero, in his De Republica, makes the argument from the very first page as we have it, that the point of politics is not to seek permanent harmony. It's not to seek perfect consensus. The Republic is one of dissensus, of argument. It's based in struggle, a struggle that can't be resolved, it can only be managed. And this is a piece of the Republican tradition that has gone actually largely unnoticed in the neo-Republican revival I talked about at the beginning, since the 1970s, that where the tendency of a number of American political philosophers has been to say that Republican political ideals are centered around an ideal of the state at peace, a state that's unified, a state of harmony. That's completely not the picture we get from Cicero in his De Republica and in his writings on rhetoric, where he represents the ideal state, the state we should all have in mind, as one of intense antagonism between the rich and the poor. And for Cicero, that's the point of politics, to manage and find equilibrium between these sectors and to advocate for their interests. So in the question and answer, I can talk about the tribunate as one very interesting office that's even Cicero, although as a senatorial rich elite himself, he was very suspicious of tribunes who were the traditional voice of the people in Roman senatorial politics. He also found interesting possibilities and virtues in them. And again, perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A. But the point I'm trying to make, the first lesson from Roman Republican thought, is that when we hold in our heads what kind of state we want to live in, if we're aiming for harmony and peace and consensus, which is from Kant and the liberal tradition, very much at the heart of much of European liberal thought, that the Republican tradition tells us, put that aside. That's a actually damaging and misleading ideal, because what we need to think of as the stuff of politics and the ideal state as a state of dissensus, of debate, antagonism, and argument. I'll just say, by way of closing on this point, the first of these 3 lessons, that especially important these days to keep this in mind, as Thomas Piketty, the analyst of, probably best known analyst of inequality in the world today, as he points out, since the 1980s, the US and Europe have seen the rise of a party system where high education and rich elites are voting on the left, but high income and high wealth elites are voting for the right. The people, the voice of the people, and popular interests in this cleavage completely go unnoticed. They fall off the table. There's no voice of the people, no voice of the poor or the less well off in Piketty's analysis of voting patterns in the US and Europe. So a serious problem if we have a political ideal where dissensus, where debate over between the haves and have-nots is supposed to be the key, the core of politics. Piketty's analysis tells us that this isn't happening, because the manipulation of politics and political discourse on both the left and the right has been co-opted by the rich. So what do we need then as citizens in terms of our institutions if we want to create a state of dissensus, a republic where debate and deliberation over who has what and how much they have and whether that's right is the goal of politics? Well, Cicero would say, and he makes this point most clearly in his orations in the case of his prosecution of a corrupt governor named Verres. Cicero says in the course of his introduction to his speech to a senatorial jury. He says, be careful, senators, because we need to keep our institutions, our juries, the Senate, our deliberative structures, we need to keep them nimble. We can't let power sit. We can't get complacent. We have to find ways to inject new voices and new ideas into the deliberation. And again, this is lost in a lot of analyses of Roman Republican practice, where we tend to see a heavy emphasis on tradition and on conservative preservation of tradition. That's certainly there, but what I'm trying to recover is an active, practical, political thinker like Cicero, and he's followed, I think, in this by Sallust and Quintilian in the imperial period, this insight that to keep the system working, it needs to be unsettled from time to time. It needs to be redesigned. It can't get too happy with itself. It can't get too comfortable. So practically speaking, whether this is a matter of setting term limits or ensuring representation from certain sectors of the socioeconomic of the population, there are many ways you can think about how to get representation from and to keep our institutions procedurally nimble and genuinely representative of broad interests. And that too, that's a matter for debate, but it's that principle of keeping institutions nimble that I want to lay on the table. And finally, I meant to put him last, but he has popped up early. And finally, communication. This is that we cultivate among ourselves as individuals. And this is really the individual lesson for us, I think, and the most important to take away from the Republican tradition, and especially Cicero's thinking. This quotation I wanted to share with you. It is necessary for the good speaker to have seen and heard many things and to have gone over many subjects in reflection and reading. He must not take possession of these things as his own property, a very interesting thing for Cicero to say, because he certainly believes in property rights, but rather take sips of them as things belonging to others. He must explore the very veins of every type, age, and class. He must taste of the minds and senses of those before whom he speaks. So Cicero is essentially saying to us that that speech is the civic glue of the Republic. This is why I called my first book The State of Speech. I'm thinking that with this thought in mind, that the glue that keeps the Republic together is the capacity to communicate with one another. And I hardly need to say that in conditions of contemporary politics, certainly in the United States and all over Europe, in Latin America and the Middle East as well, the capacity to communicate, to debate in a controlled way is one of the, and by control I mean to have debates not devolve into physical fighting. That this is one of the things that makes me most nervous about democratic Republican politics today. That the capacity and the habit of exchanging views and allowing one's mind to be changed, and learning how to persuade other people. I mean, all the things that are encapsulated in this quotation, that those are virtues and habits of thought that are far too rare today, and in fact, not viewed, I think, as virtues by many actors in politics today and among regular citizens. So as I see it, and I'll come to a close and open it up for questions, I think the task before us as citizens is to acknowledge our plurality, our difference, to acknowledge our interdependence among one another, and to make it real in our politics. And this is what I think of to think like Romans, at least Romans like Cicero. We need to cultivate these habits of thought, to see the Republic, to see the state as a state of dissensus, of disagreement, to see, second, the importance of injecting a sense of dynamism and practices of dynamism in our institutions, in our law courts, in our political assemblies, to maintain space for experimentation there. And thirdly, ourselves as individuals in our educational system and in the way we interact with one another, to make it our top priority to learn to listen and communicate, to give voice and hear to the interests of many different types of people, to fund an educational system that teaches the art of speech and nourishes that art, which attunes us to the positions and experiences of others, that awakens us even to the divided allegiances in ourselves. So I think these three lessons, as I've presented them, can renew Republican politics and make it sustainable for future generations. And I think they provide at least a provocative, I hope, thought-provoking answer to those critics who say that turning to ancient Rome is useless and even dangerous, that we, in fact, can say there's something useful to be found in these texts, at least to provoke debate among ourselves. So I welcome your questions and thought. I hope I haven't spoken for too long, and I will turn it over to